Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to this Mythic Plus Week Analyzed. This week's affixes are Tyrannical, Raging, Necrotic, and the Awakened pattern has switched over to the B pattern from the A pattern that it was on last week. If you're interested in a video where I go over all of my routes for all the dungeons this week and talk about what is happening in each of them, I have one of those already made 12 weeks ago for the last time we had these affixes up. And instead, in this video, I'm going to talk about some higher level things about which dungeons are relatively good and bad this week, which kind of compositions are good, and whether or not this is a good week to do dungeons for each kind of key level and who the pressure is going to be on this week. So let's get started. I'm going to start by talking about very high level keys. So world first level keys. Last week we saw numerous world first keys being done. This week we are not going to see any at all. Tyrannical is a huge roadblock compared to Fortified if you are pushing keys above level 20. If you look at the scoreboard right now at the time of recording this, here is how far you have to go down the rankings to find a Tyrannical key. 567 is the number we're at right now. There are 566 Fortified runs better than the world's best Tyrannical run, which was actually done on a fairly rough Necrotic week a few weeks ago. We may see a few slightly better runs than this 25 here, but we are not going to see many. The overwhelming majority of high key pushers are going to be taking this week off because it is a Tyrannical week, and Tyrannical weeks they're not very fun for those sorts of players because the key level ceiling is dramatically lower than it is on a Fortified week. Now, is this going to impact you if your goal is to push score this week? It depends. If your name is on this list here, if you're somebody who's been trying to push, top level keys or whatever, yes, this is going to impact your ability to push score this week. You're probably not going to earn any points. If you're trying to push 20s or something this week, it's going to be a very hard week. If you're pushing 18s, 17s, this week will probably be okay. The Tyrannical component of it, at least, compared to an average Fortified week, can be okay. And if you're trying to get all your 15s done in time this week, it is totally doable this week, and in fact, it may be easier for some groups than Fortified weeks. At those lower levels, often Tyrannical can actually feel easier than Fortified. And as you get down even further below that, that becomes even more true, because trash mobs can kill unaware tanks in a way that bosses, it's a little bit less easy to get caught off guard by bosses, even on Tyrannical, than it is on Fortified. That being said, this is not a week where I recommend bringing an undergeared or underexperienced tank, because the affix combination is really all about tanking. Raging and Necrotic are two affixes that really incentivize your tank to kite effectively as the pack is getting low on health. Now, luckily, even though these both seem like pretty nasty affixes, the good news is that the counterplay is the same for both of them. To beat Raging, you want to run away when the pack is in the Raging affix, right? 30%. To beat Necrotic, you also want to run away when the pack is low and you have a bunch of Necrotic stacks on you. So by doing the same action, you're going to play around both of those affixes. That's a little bit different than some of the other Necrotic weeks we see, like Bursting Necrotic, where, the natural play pattern against one of those affixes can actually hurt you on the other one. So that's good news for this week, and that makes this week a little bit less bad than perhaps those affixes look initially. There are some further problems, though. Namely, Necrotic plus Tyrannical means that there are a lot of dungeon boss encounters that are going to be pretty rough. So like Volkal, pretty fast auto-attacking boss. This can be a very difficult one for tanks to reset Necrotic stacks on. Any boss that you can't kite and reset stacks on, so for instance like Waycrest Manor, Rawl the Gluttonous, or Mechagon Junkyard Gunker, these are bosses where it can be pretty easy to not be able to reset your Necrotic stacks. One useful thing to have access to in your group this week is something like an Arms Warrior or a Demon Hunter, a Havoc Demon Hunter, who have parry taunt abilities. So they can put up Die by the Sword and then taunt, or they can put up Netherwalk and then taunt, or even Blur and then taunt. And by doing that, they can allow your tank to reset Necrotic during these boss encounters. That can be a really good thing if you have either a tank who's able to call for it, or a DPS player who's looking for your tank to have a few seconds left on a Necrotic debuff, and then doing that taunt strategy. That can be something that's really helpful. The other thing that I would recommend doing in your group this week is you want to play stuff that helps your team kite. Stuff that helps your tank avoid these stacks of Necrotic. So this is things like Binding Shot, Engineering Knock Belts if you can get those, making sure you're using things like Typhoon, Ring of Peace, Ursul's Vortex, Thunderstorm, all those sorts of abilities. There are even some essence choices that you can make this week that I think are pretty good. So Sphere of Suppression for many tanks as a major this week can be pretty useful. It can let you kite away from mobs. It can provide a auto attack decrease on them and reduce the speed with which you gain necrotic stacks. If you're a protection warrior in particular, Conflict and Strife Major is actually something that I recommend in almost every dungeon this week against necrotic, because it roots enemies for a second away from you. And what you can do is, if you're an avatar, you can basically have this thing pretty close to full uptime, and you can keep effectively damaging a pack while taking very few stacks of necrotic from it. So that's something that can be extremely useful to have. Of course, Enrage Dispels for raging is very valuable. The classes that can do that are Hunter and Druid. So bringing one of those this week, or making sure that the one that you do bring knows that they need to have their Spirit Shock bound from their Spirit Beast, or their Soothe bound if they're a Druid, that's going to be a useful thing to have as well. Another item you might not be aware of but can be useful for your tanks is the red punch card Trajectory Analysis. So many of you know about the Cyclotronic Blast red punch card, but here is another red punch card that tanks can use to get taking physical damage grants dodge for a few seconds, and the effect stacks. First of all, necrotic is physical damage now. It's a bleed, so that can increase this. And just getting auto-attacked by things as well can cause you to start stacking up dodge, which means you'll get less necrotic stacks. So this is a strong week to be running a punch card trinket with a trajectory analysis slotted in there for tanks. Absolutely something worth considering if you can get your hands on this thing. Just in general, the goal this week for tanks is surviving long enough to build some threat, having enough damage to build a lot of threat, and then kiting as needed at the end of pulls there. Some extremely strong pieces of utility that you can bring with your group: Balance Druid Trees, Earth Elemental, especially from Elemental Shaman versus the other two specs, because they have more control over it than the other two specs do. Those sorts of things in particular can do a really good job this week of helping your tank run away and drop stacks as needed. Depending on what your composition has access to, you're going to have different amounts of things to deal with these affixes, but if you have whatever you have, you need to make sure you have a plan for your pulls. And if you don't have a good strategy for dealing with Raging Necrotic in your group, you're going to need to just be really aware of it on your pulls, and your tank is just going to have to run away without using any of those abilities, and you're going to have to be looking for opportunistic resets of stacks, and maybe saving burst damage cooldowns for the end of a pack rather than on pull can be a useful thing to do this week as well. A lot of times the way to optimize your overall damage on pull is to pop all your cooldowns on pull. But the problem with that is that you do a bunch of damage to everything, it gets 30% health, you run out of damage, and then it stays at 30% health for a long time and is raging. Instead, if you hold your damage cooldown, slowly DPS things down to 50%, and then just nuke it all down at the end, that will get you through the burst or through the raging window very quickly. So that is my other recommendation this week. All right, let's talk about which dungeons are going to be relatively easy and relatively hard this week. The one dungeon I'm going to shout out as being a pretty good dungeon this week is the Motherlode. Raging is a pretty tricky affix at the start of the dungeon, but other than that, I believe the Motherlode is the only dungeon where the trash is nasty enough that Tyrannical weeks remain better than Fortified weeks. If you remember at the start of this video when we looked at the top Tyrannical run in the world, there's no surprise to me that it is a Motherlode dungeon. I think that this is the keystone if you're pushing high keys that can still be accomplished this week at a reasonably competitive level. Now, the problem is, even if you were a team that could push, a 26 Motherlode or something this week, to do that, you're going to have to time a bunch of 25s. And there are a lot of dungeons that are pretty rough this week to time on 25s. Workshop in particular gets my vote for deadest key of the week if you're operating at a level where stuff can get one-shotty. So if you're doing 15 keys, it's not going to be something that affects you very much. But say you're used to doing, you're able to do 20s some weeks in some dungeons. You step foot into a 20 workshop, you are just going to get murdered by these boss abilities. They are really, really brutal. On 25 Fortified, you have to do all kinds of things to be able to survive the last boss here. On 25 Tyrannical, it is not happening. It's over. You're going to die repeatedly, assuming you can even make it this far. And this boss really scales out of control with a long time in the boss fight. The others are fairly easy but long, and you might get a second set of vent jets on this fight, even with good hammer use, and that can start to get really painful. Vent jets just does a huge amount of damage. Other dungeons that have some really tough bosses like Underrot, Cragmaw the Infested, this thing can be a real brick wall for groups. A Taldazar, like I mentioned, another one that's, it's fairly tough this week. The Spider is the obelisk that's in this bad position here on the B week. The one that you'd rather, like last week you were able to fight this was the Blob, and you could just fight it with the last boss fairly easily. The Spider is trickier for most groups to fight with the last boss, so that makes a Taldazar pretty rough this week, not to mention the fact that many of these bosses are nasty with Necrotic Tyrannical, especially Volkal and actually Razan. The good news actually in the Underrot, back to that, is that you do have the blood in this spot again. So I think the B Awaken pattern, this might be the only dungeon where it's better than the A pattern. And so that is good news if you do go to this dungeon, is that you just fight the Blob with the last boss, and that's a lot easier than when it was the Fear guy last week. Maybe not a lot easier, but easier at least, and less intimidating for players that haven't done it yet. King's Rest, of course, remains a dungeon that I fear on Tyrannical weeks. These boss encounters are pretty tricky, and with Necrotic Tyrannical in particular, like the last boss, can just really murder your tank. It's hard to reset stacks here, and you need so much healing on this fight as well. So that is tough. Raging Trash, especially these couple pulls here, can also pretty easily wipe you, and if you wipe in this part of the dungeon, it's over. You're releasing you're releasing back here, and you've got a 5-minute run back ahead of you, and that is not a good feeling. So that is definitely another dungeon that I'd be very scared of this week. Although, to be fair, it's bad on most weeks. One dungeon that I think is a little bit... It's kind of... There's two competing directions here. Temple Citralis, like, Necrotic and Raging are not too bad in here, but the Necrotic Tyrannical combination on Galv in particular is basically the entire dungeon. If you come into this dungeon and you can beat Necrotic Tyrannical Galv at whatever key level you're doing, the rest of the dungeon is pretty easy. The timer shouldn't be too tight. It's a marathon of a last boss, but if you make it here with like 8 minutes or whatever, you can do this whole place. So Necrotic Tyrannical Temple is it's doable up to the point where Galv stops being doable for you, and then it's a super hard brick wall. So this one's an interesting dungeon for this week for sure. Anyways, those are just some of my thoughts on some of the dungeons, some of the things you can be doing this week, some of the kind of class abilities that I would emphasize this week, some of the talent choices I'd make. If you have any questions, if you want to know some more advice or me to elaborate more on anything I said in here, if anything I said is confusing, ask it in the comments below, and if I remember to read my comments on the video, I'll try and reply to them. Remember to check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos, where you can also ask me those kind of questions, and you're a little bit more likely to get a reply. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.